out of our systems. We need better ways of acquiring information. And so this kind of task force was kind of a first look at what you would need to do to be able to do something like that, either working with the current ILS vendors and then people building tools today. So the charge. This was convened in 2007. Who's keeping track of the time? I can't see the... Okay, thank you. I want to give Emily most of the time. All right, so it was convened in 2007 by the DLF, and basically it was both of them now. Basically, this was set up to really just analyze the problems with integrating ILS systems and to create kind of a technical recommendation. And I use the word recommendation because what we're doing is we're not creating a final product, and that's actually should be something that you need that's really important to put out. This is really an idea, and it's an idea that's going to come in the form of a recommendation where we're assuming that somebody afterwards is going to pick this up and come out with a set of actual implementable recommendation. So this is the group membership. Represents a lot of different people from a lot of different organizations, a lot of different ILS groups.
Oh no, that was a bad idea.
I got it. A lot of different groups represented. And so basically what we decide, what's going on in with this recommendation is we're recommending functions and bindings. And so these are really abstract functions. Basically the idea is you recognize a set of functionalities you'd like to have, like for example the ability to harvest all of your bibliographic data from the ILS system. Seems like a pretty good idea. And so the idea with this recommendation is we provide recommendations for abstract functions and then kind of expected parameters and exceptions you might see from those functions. Now we don't recommend a set of technology that are going to be used for those things, even though we do recommend bindings. For example, harvesting bibliographic content sounds an awful lot like OAI, so we might recommend that might be something that people might consider using. But that's kind of the idea behind this document. And also, as often as possible, we encourage the use of non-library specific technologies and formats. I think one of the other ideas behind this is that in the DLF is to start being able for the library community to take advantage of as much work being done outside of the library community as possible. The other thing that came out of the meeting in the fall DLF forum is this idea of how vendors or people working with this standard would implement it. And the idea was that if the DLF was to put out a standard, the long standard, basically asking for everything, whether or not it would be able to be implemented quickly and right away. And so basically what had happened was people were starting to talk about, well, what could the DLF say is kind of core and what would be expanded functionality? What would the DLF say is kind of required to be able to meet the minimum specifications for this project? And then what would they consider to be full implementation? So there were basically three usage profiles that were developed. What would be minimal for OPAC, for a minimum OPAC supplement, things for an OPAC alternative, and for a robust discovery platform. And then the functions that were defined and recommended were broken into those specific groups of core functionality and expanded functionality, so that as whatever happens after this group, there's some guidance in terms of what functionality we would consider to be necessary in order to create these discovery and applications. And I'm going to let Emily now talk about all those things.
Okay, so I don't know if most of you saw, but I think last week before the conference I sent out on the Code4Lib list a link to the draft of our recommendation. And so I don't know if people had a chance to look at that or not. I'm going to just talk really quickly about the kind of 4 functional areas that we've defined. And the first is something that we've labeled data aggregation, and we would consider this to be pretty much core functionality all the way. And the idea that we need to be able to harvest our records from our systems in bulk, and we need a good way to do that. And obviously that's critical when we're working with a lot of systems like Solar that are building local indexes in order to have enhanced discovery mechanisms for our data. So we need to be able to get the data out. And this also includes the concept of what I put here is incremental harvesting. So we need to be able to harvest just the things that have changed since a certain date or have been added. So we're not trying to harvest our entire bibliographic database every night, which isn't feasible for every institution. So you can see here some examples of functions that we've listed. The harvest expanded records, I'll just mention, when we say expanded, we've kind of coined that as a term for referring to every piece of information that we can get about a bibliographic identifier. So we're talking bibliographic information, MARC holdings information if it exists, but also the sort of non-standard item types of information. So in pretty much every piece of the specification, we're trying to think about how we can get all of that information out of our systems. And harvesting authority records, because I know that you can get authority records from LC, but the concept that we have is that libraries might need to work with more manageable sets of authority data that represent their local collection. And so that we can build, if we can pull these things out of our system, we can build different kinds of tools to help move our users from their natural vocabulary to whatever the controlled vocabulary is without them having, something that's beyond title, author, and subject searching in the OPAC, which, I think a lot of us would like to move beyond the browse heading lists. But I won't say too much. That might ignite a discussion. So the second really big section is what we're calling real-time search. And this is about having sort of on-the-fly access to the data, so not harvesting in bulk. Oh, I should have said for that first one, obviously OAI would be a candidate that we would strongly recommend as a technical binding. The big kicker here, obviously, is the ability to get real-time access to our status data. We've discovered that right away as we start trying to use other tools that we need to be able to do that easily. So that's what folks like ViewFind and XC are already working on, solving those types of problems. So one question that people might have is, but this extends beyond, we're talking just beyond status information, so also on the fly being able to look up the entire record. And so you might wonder why that's needed, but when we're moving this data to external systems, I may be normalizing the data in some storage mechanism that doesn't perfectly map one-to-one back to my MARC record. So there may be instances where I want to pull a MARC record back for sending to RefWorks, or if I need to send it to Zotero or something like that. We can definitely see that an external discovery application might not be the best place to store that sort of specific MARC level information. So we want on-the-fly access to all of the information about the record and not just the status. Obviously, we have federated real-time searching there. I think this could be especially important for integration with non-library discovery applications that may not want to harvest our entire data set and index it externally, but may want to do something with real-time integration of search results. And obviously, a lot of us are already using federated searching on our catalogs. We have a number of possible bindings here. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but we are trying to recommend moving away from Z3950. And trying to recommend instead to consider SRUW and OpenSearch as options, or maybe even just some simple REST-based web services as we move into the future. And I talked about this a little bit, but since a number of the functions involve retrieving what we're calling this expanded record in this real-time search area as well, there's not really standardized agreement on how an ILS stores item information. So we've done a little bit of work in this task force to investigate metadata schemas that could describe sort of this breadth of information, bibliographic plus holdings plus item information. And so for the most part, our concept is now that that's going to involve combining several different types of metadata schemas into a record. So might envision something like MARC XML bibliographic and holdings record combined with NZIP item elements or something. There's more information about that on the wiki, and we're really open to feedback about that aspect of this. So a third section has to do with patron functionality. And some people might ask, and we have asked, why do we need patron functionality in this API? But as we start to implement external discovery systems and we start to see functionality that could replace our OPAC, we realize that our patrons do more in the OPAC than just discover things. So they also use it to manage their account. They use it to request delivery of items that they've discovered but aren't currently available. So in order for a discovery application to become more than just a supplement, but in order for it to become a true alternative, we need to be able to provide the same level of discovery to delivery services. These are pretty self-explanatory functions here. The only two I wanted to mention was lookup patron, which would be the ability to look up a patron using another identifier, like a campus identifier, and be able to look up the internal ILS identifier for that patron that you could then use in all of your interactions with the system. And get patron status, which is sort of a first attempt at the idea that we know a patron status sometimes has an impact on what services that they can request. So if they're a faculty or an undergraduate, and that this piece of information may help us as we're building systems that are providing options to them. And I'll just mention possible bindings we've been looking at include NSIP and SIP2. And again, we're very interested in feedback about that area. This last section, we've sort of termed OPAC embed escape. So one scenario that we're considering is that some institutions might be primarily concerned with developing better tools for discovery. And they might be happy to leave services like patron functionality or full display of bibliographic records in their existing OPAC. Or it may be that some ILS vendors are quicker to implement tools for harvesting and real-time search than for external access to patron account management. So the OPAC embed escape section is provided for the scenario where there may be an external discovery application that functions as an OPAC supplement, but not an OPAC alternative. So institutions, in this first case, institutions might want to include external content or services within an OPAC display. So think about dynamically generated links to Google Book Search, going out and checking to see if they have the full text, and if they do, bringing back a link. Or OCA is a good example. Or services like I know what Pentags has done to integrate links to Pentags in their OPAC records. So this could be supported by what's been possibly termed an output rewritable page behavior that provides a bibliographic display that has an identifier and addressable location, so that we're better able to write library-side JavaScript that can easily go in and snag a bibliographic identifier and rewrite the page with whatever added content we might want to add in. And the second case to consider here is that we might want to take the bibliographic HTML that's being produced by our OPAC and transform it into something else without having to write another complete application. So for instance, we might want to take the HTML and turn it into RSS formatting for an RSS feed. Or we might want to make it into a simplified HTML display for mobile phones. So this could be supported by what's labeled here as an output intermediate format behavior that would generate OPAC pages in XML. So I think like III already does this if you have the XML server or something like that. Evergreen maybe. But the idea that we would have something that we could transform and send out without having to, with using just some XSLT instead of having to completely rewrite sort of a catalog application. Okay, so where do we go from here? Obviously, we're in that soliciting feedback phase right now. So there's been an invited meeting for library ILS vendors and also people who are working on external discovery applications that are being layered on ILSs. And that's going to happen next week. And also, we're looking for feedback from the library community and from developers like you guys. We're hoping to finalize the draft for the DLF Spring Forum in the end of April. And at that forum, there'll probably be some recommendations made to DLF. So really the charge of this task group was to create sort of an API or an idea. And the question is going to be, where do we go from there? What role does DLF play? How are these recommendations going to be finalized, maintained? How are they going to be implemented? Are there going to be code repositories and things like that? So I think there's going to be discussion on this sort of how we move forward at the next topic at the next DLF forum this spring. But obviously we have a lot of questions. And how can you participate? Obviously everyone here is calling for participation, so I know that you can only participate in so many projects. But you can read the draft we sent out and send us some feedback. We now have an open list. I apologize for earlier confusion. You can join the conversation. We're hosting a breakout session where we just basically want to answer questions and bounce ideas around and see if you guys think that we're crazy or if people are interested in this topic. Or you can join the open mailing list and see what everyone else is saying or not saying. And you can also obviously contribute code. So we want to find a way to partner with the existing efforts that are going on. So the folks at Viewfind are writing connectors for looking up real-time availability for all the ILSs, and the folks at XC are working on OAI PMH connectors for harvesting bibliographic data. And we want to find a way to maybe build on and generalize those efforts that are already happening. If you're working on an open source ILS, it's something you could consider implementing part or all of the recommendation within that ILS. Or if you have a vended ILS solution, you can encourage your ILS vendor to implement it themselves. And this is just some information for anyone looking at the slides later of where you can get information, get the draft recommendation. We're working on a wiki, and the URL is really terrible. So I put a tiny URL, or you can just Google DLF ILS wiki, and you'll get there. And I think we actually have 4 minutes for questions. So.
Anyone have questions One thing you guys didn't mention with the patron thing that we've been trying to do is departmental affiliation kinds of things for, customization and personalization. That's something that would be really nice.
Yeah, I think that probably comes involved in the patron status. Oh, sorry. I think that would partly fall under this idea of patron status, whatever that means, or being able to use a combination of things where you look up your university identifier and then compare it to the ILS. But yeah, I mean it was talked about a little bit, and I think it's kind of embedded into these functions.
Because one of the things that happens is, for some places whose universities don't have their uniform sign-on, unified identifier stuff together, the ILS is where all that information happens to be. So I happen to be at an institution where that's the case. So I think it's good if you make some of that stuff a little more explicit.
We are as well. I mean, we're an innovative librarian, so our patron statuses are all tied up within the patron types that they actually are, and depending on if you're a faculty or you're a member of this faculty group, you're going to get different rights to different pieces of information. So,
any more questions?
You mentioned speaking to ILS vendors about implementing this. Have you actually contacted any of the vendors about extending? I mean, we're an innovative shop also. I mean, there's a patron API, but some of this other stuff doesn't exist. Have they given you any idea about whether they'd be interested in developing that stuff?
So we're actually going to be meeting with all the ILS vendors. Innovative will be one of them on the 5th, 6th? 5th or 6th of March. I can't remember. 6th, thank you. 6th of March, where all the vendors are going to come together and give feedback on this particular functionality, or at least the draft that we've talked about. But I think you'd be surprised. A lot of ILS vendors actually do support, to some degree, most of this functionality. They just might only support it with certain partners. For example, Innovative actually supports a very broad INSIP format implementation, but they only support it for a handful of vendors that allow for interaction with the system. So I think there's a lot of functionality that they probably already have that exists that they could just open up to a larger group if they decided to.
Just piggybacking on the NSIP stuff, I've noticed in my experiences that vendors implement these, even though it's a standard, they implement them differently. Have you faced that or dealt with that and maybe come up with a best practice about how to implement these things?
This will actually be, I think, what comes next. And I think the question that gets answered, like I said, a lot of this is an idea. What exactly does everybody kind of think we need? And then at the next point, I'm not quite sure where the DLF goes from there. I think the next point, because this was actually a point of discussion on the group. What I wanted to come out of this was a unified API, basically that we give people something that was implementable. But what the vision was more of an idea that then could be taken to next steps, which may include some people from this group or a completely different group. I don't know.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention, we sort of talked about it as a very small group and think that I'm not sure whether the next step is going to be a written document, but I think it might be very interesting to have the next step be actual reference implementations of specific pieces or all of this so that we could have a model to show to people. And we're done.
All right. Thanks a lot.